Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Xavier Salomon, the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick Collection. The exhibition Andrea del Sarto, the Renaissance Workshop in Action, opened this week here at the museum, and it is a truly extraordinary occasion to see 45 drawings by the master and 3 paintings by this astonishing Florentine artist. For the first time together, not only here in the United States, well, in New York, but probably altogether since they left Andrea's workshop after the painter's death in 1530 of the plague in Florence. Like many exhibitions, this has been a group effort, and I was very lucky to work on this project with a team that, Giorgio Vasari would agree with me, has truly been, like Andrea's art, senza errori, without faults. Denise Allen, formerly curator here at the Frick Collection and now in the Department of Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum across the street, and Amy Ng, associate curator at the Frick, were both instrumental in bringing this exhibition together from the very initial stages until the very last moments a few days ago when the show was up and ready to go. But the mastermind behind this entire exhibition, really the person who initiated the project and its creative director, one would say, is tonight's speaker. Dr. Julian Brooks, curator in the Department of Drawings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It has been an immense pleasure to work closely with Dr. Brooks on every detail of this exhibition and the outstanding accompanying catalogue. Dr. Brooks is truly one of today's world experts in the field of Old Master drawings. He studied and received his PhD on the drawings of Andrea Boscoli at Worcester College at the University of Oxford, and he worked in the print rooms of the Royal Collection and at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, before, in 2004, joining the Getty Museum. His interests are wide, and in Los Angeles he is responsible currently for the Italian, British, and Spanish drawings and watercolors in the collection. One of the great collections of drawings in this country. He has published on a number of topics and has curated and co-curated many exhibitions on very different subjects. For example, Taddeo and Federico Zuccaro, artist brothers in Renaissance Rome in 2007 and 8, Leonardo da Vinci and the Art of Sculpture in 2010, and Luminous paper, British drawings and watercolors in 2011. In 2006-07, he curated the memorable exhibition Guercino, Mind to Paper, which was a groundbreaking exploration of the graphic work of one of Italy's greatest Baroque artists. For all of those who were lucky to see this exhibition at the Getty and at the Courtauld Gallery in London, it was really an unforgettable show. Most recently, Dr. Brooks co-curated the exhibition Turner, Painting Set Free, which was on view at the Getty earlier this year, while he was working on the present Andrea del Sarto exhibition. This range of topics demonstrates Dr. Brooks' brilliant breadth of knowledge and his outstanding contributions to this important field in art history. He published in 2010 the book Master Drawings Close Up, an introduction to the study of works on paper, which is a precious tool for all of those who plan to learn more about drawings. And I would recommend this as a book for anyone who is interested in starting to learn about the subject. Currently, he's working on a fascinating exhibition which will open at the Getty in the summer of next year, 2016, which is Bacon, Freud, and the School of London. This evening, Dr. Brooks will present a lecture entitled Andrea del Sarto, the Tailor's Son and the Making of Masterpieces, introducing the exhibition he curated here, looking at Andrea del Sarto's astonishing creative mind and analyzing ways in which he observed life around him, in his workshop and outside it, to create his outstanding works of art. Tonight's lecture has been made possible by the Robert H. Smith Foundation, who I would like to acknowledge here for their generous support of the Frick Collection. I would also like to remind you that tonight's lecture will be streaming live on our website, and it will be available for later viewing online. I would also like to ask you to please turn off your cell phones out of respect for our speaker and your fellow audience members. And finally, following tonight's lecture, you will have the opportunity to visit the exhibition in the lower galleries and in the Oval Room until 7:30. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Brooks.
Thank you so much, Xavier. All I have to do now is to live up to all that. But thank you so much to all of you for coming this evening. It's a treat to see the room so full. If you told me 20 years ago that I would be co-curating an exhibition at the Frick Collection, I would have said something like "blow me down," or perhaps use slightly stronger language. But the Frick really is my favorite museum in the world. I mean, I guess I should be slightly more diplomatic and say, along with the Getty, my favorite museum in the world. But it's just such a treat to have this exhibition here, such a combination of my loves and interests. And it's really been such a happy collaboration with Amy and Xavier. And I'm very grateful to them and to Ian for the invitation to speak this evening. So, if you've been looking at the exhibition in the next door room, you might have noticed on the National Gallery portrait of a man this monogram of two interlocking A's, Andrea d'Agnolo, Andrea the son of Agnolo. And he's obviously following in the tradition of Dürer and Lucas van Leyden by signing his name with a monogram, and as a sign of its completion. And he used the same monogram on a drawing, the back of a drawing in the Uffizi, with the crucial addition, the Andrea del Sarto. And that, of course, is his beginnings, the tailor's son. Our word sartorial comes from the Italian sarto. So, Andrea d'Agnolo, the son of Agnolo the tailor. And I think, as you look through Andrea del Sarto's work, you're constantly reminded of that. Details like the sort of rucking up of the shirt underneath the tunic there, and these amazing fabrics, colors, and just the observation of how they fall absolutely pervades Andrea del Sarto's work. And you really get a sense that, this is somebody who grew up in Taylor's shop. He was looking at fabrics, constantly fascinated by how the figure could be enveloped by them. And I also think it may come into some of his other working processes. So, for example, and we'll go into this a little bit later, but how he would use the same fabric you'll see here, exactly the same fabric, right, is used in these three different paintings. The Barberini Holy Family on the left from 1525, and a Holy Family in St. Petersburg in the middle from a couple of years later, and the Medici Holy Family at right, which is in our exhibition here. And, how is it that he's using this same drapery, this same clothing again and again and again? So this evening I really wanted to look through, the entire scope and the range of Andrea del Sarto's work and his working process. So we'll look at compositional studies, life studies, his sort of practical tools, his reuse of drawings and cartoons, and then just finish up with, briefly with a discovery and a mystery. And this, of course, is the great man himself on the right, Andrea del Sarto's self-portrait, just done on a roof tile. Vasari records that he had a little bit of paint left over one day, and so he made his self-portrait on a roof tile, and that's still in the Uffizi today, later in his life, about 1528 or so. So if we begin with compositional studies, like if you think, you're planning a major altarpiece or even an altarpiece, a devotional work, the whole point is you have to plan it out first and decide what's going where, working out just the choreography, essentially, of the figures. And with these two images, you can see just how far Andrea took the process of designing a composition over the span of his career. The drawing on the left dates from about 1509. It's in the Louvre. And you can see how it's very much set in the modes of the late 1400s, 1480s, 1490s. Sort of very static, this grand altar, relatively highly worked sort of media, pen and ink, but brush and wash as well. And then about 20 years later, this drawing, also in the exhibition, from Berlin and in Andrea's red chalk. And you can see just how different they are in conception. This is really describing everything. This one is sort of indicative in a way. He's really, he is working out exactly what will go where, but he doesn't have to describe it. It's literally just information packed in through abstracted forms and through roughly, just very brief sort of shorthand. And of course, we have to remember that these drawings were all made for Andrea's benefit. He wasn't saying to himself, well, I'm going to wow them all at the Frick in 500 years' time with my, bravura draftsmanship. They are working tools that he kept in the studio that he made for himself. And, some of them would have sort of been thrown away at the end of it, And of all the drawings that we have from Andrea, the fewest in number are these compositional studies. And that's true of, of many Renaissance artists. But with Andrea, it's literally a handful. Almost all of them are here in the exhibition. And it's sort of interesting. I think they're the sort of drawing that just wasn't necessarily preserved. And they're also a sort of drawing that has an incredible variety to it. If you look at the two sheets we just looked at and then look at this one, you could think that they were by three different artists, right? They're very different styles. And that's purely because they're made for different purposes. This one seems all about capturing the light, this very strong light on the for the Holy Family painting at the right, about 1517 or so. And in this drawing, you can see really where an artist like Jacopo Pontormo, who was one of Andrea del Sarto's pupils, you can see where Pontormo comes from. And we know that Pontormo actually knew this drawing, this very drawing, because there are some studies on the back that Pontormo then uses for one of his own works. But you can see here how Andrea del Sarto is really trying to capture the light of the figures, the reflected light on this figure, and this wonderful emphasis on outline as he sort of carves the figures from the paper, using the white of the paper as the highlight, and then essentially carving with these strong outlines the figures into making the space for them. This is one of my favorite compositional studies from Del Sarto, and it's the type of drawing that I'm sure there must have been dozens and dozens of them, and yet now it's practically the only one of its type in his corpus. It's a study for one of his most famous works, the Madonna of the Sack, in Santissima Annunziata in Florence. For centuries, one of the most famous works of art in Florence. And, Titian went to Florence especially to see that work and praised it highly. And artists ever since, it's one of the things you did on the Grand Tour if you were in Florence. Or in all succeeding centuries, you went to see Andrea del Sarto's Madonna of the Sack. And it was famed for this wonderful combination of dignity and informality. You have the Madonna and Child, but then you have St. Joseph just leaning casually on a sack, reading. And it occupies this high position in a cloister, so over a door. And Andrea del Sarto already, takes account of that in his preliminary sketches for it. So this drawing from the British Museum is a study for that painting. And I just love it because you really see, it's almost like an insight into his mind. You see him literally considering a solution for it. At the top, this kneeling, rather grand figure of the Madonna and Child with swags adorning the lunette. And then he sort of brings her down to ground a bit more, and the Christ Child blessing the viewer. And then here, sort of, the Madonna much more humbly just sitting literally on the ledge, and the Christ Child comically trying to crawl off the edge of the ledge, and she's sort of holding him back. And you just see, he literally will consider an option and then move on, and consider something else and move on. And it's like just, looking into his mind as he considers all these these options for the composition. And I think this sort of drawing doesn't now survive because, if you think of it and you're in a Renaissance studio and you're looking for works that you're going to reuse, we'll talk about how the studio reused drawings soon, but head studies you'd reuse, but a sort of fragmentary initial study like this has a limited sort of use in the studio afterwards. And now, of course, it's fascinating for us, but for someone like Vasari, who was himself one of Del Sarto's pupils and who bragged about having a very highly finished drawing by Del Sarto in his collection, for Vasari, I'm sure this would have been a sort of throwaway study. This is a drawing in the Getty collection that is a preliminary study for evangelists that were used in this altar frontal, now in Cortona. And I love it because it's the sort of drawing that no one else at the time was doing. Andrea del Sarto in his time was absolutely as famous as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. None of those masters drew like this. This very abstracted, fragmented way of rendering the human figure that consequently became incredibly influential throughout the 16th century, so that much of 16th century Florentine drawing, and therefore much of Western draftsmanship as we know it, comes from studies like this, abstracting the form and pulling the form, identifying the form within the mass, and managing to convey it through very shorthand strokes. And I just love the pentimenti that you have in the head here, where it's looking in about 4 different directions. And it sort of animates the drawing. You have this sort of blurring effect, essentially, from the figure. And, Andrea, because this is just for him, he doesn't have to erase it or make it look good. He just can draw again, draw again, draw again. So this drawing we talked about a little bit, but I just wanted to show you it in relation to the painting that it was made a study for. It's a painting in it was in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Berlin and was lost in the Second War, destroyed in World War II. But you can see already in this drawing, done, 1528, at the end of his career, when he's sort of 42 years old, and how much information he gives in such a tiny sheet. I mean, you'll go downstairs and look at this drawing, and it's small, a few inches by a few inches. But if you think of it, there's not one aspect of the composition that isn't studied there. He's got the lighting, he's got the rough facial types, the drapery of the figures, the positions of the figures. It conveys all this information, and yet it's so brief. And, probably took, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? It's just, absolutely amazing to be able to encapsulate all that information. And, probably one of a number of studies just done as he works through what he wanted this altarpiece to look like. And of course, for a painting such as this, we're very lucky to have a couple of drawings that relate to it and that are here shown in the exhibition. And it's wonderful because it's actually 2 sheets of paper, but he drew on both sides of those 2 sheets of paper. So we actually have 4 different studies. And in the catalogue, Xavier talks about exactly the sequence of studies, but you can see here how he, begins with these very brief studies of the figure, and then gradually works through, having a turning, this idea of having the head turning back towards the viewer, and the very prominent elbow. And I love that this final solution that he made here is, it's absolutely so close to the painting. And again, it conveys so much information, but it's so brief. There's nothing to it, just a line here, smudge for the nose, the eye, even this very boldly done, the tunic, but really conveyed in such brief terms. And then he, the miracle of it, that he could actually convey this into a final painting like that, where in an age of often very static and sort of rather iconic portraiture. He can really convey the immediacy and the animation of the sitter as we interrupt him reading a book, and he turns to look over his shoulder and asks what we want. And then, of course, there's this compositional study, one of his most famous drawings from the Uffizi. Just wonderful, in its study of drapery and the clothing, the broad arrangement of the figure sitting in a chair, the face not really treated. And that's because, Andrea knew that he would make another study of the face. And this is also in the exhibition. And this is a face that we come to know very well when we look through Andrea del Sarto's work. It's the face of Lucrezia, his wife. And this seems to have been, these seem to have been studies for a portrait of her. But he used her features again and again for so many of his Madonnas in his paintings. And Vasari, Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer, in his 1550 Lives of the Artists, which incidentally, Andrea del Sarto is given the longest life of any of the artists, longer than Michelangelo's. So, Vasari has a lot to say about him, but sadly, a lot of it is basically vitriol against Andrea del Sarto's wife, Lucrezia. And Lucrezia comes up again and again, and Vasari basically says, well, Andrea, would have come to something if Lucrezia hadn't held him back, hadn't, called him back from France, hadn't, bled him dry of money, all these things. And Vasari, as I said, was in Del Sarto's studio, and somehow he and Lucrezia clearly had a big falling out. And and Vasari, because he's writing history, can write what he wants. And Lucrezia is the one that loses out. But we know from documents that most of this just isn't true. And it's very interesting that in the 1568 later edition of the Lives, most of it is gone. And we don't know if Lucrezia, threatened to call the lawyers on Vasari, or, we know that Vasari was basically told to sort of get more to the point and talk about the art, So thankfully that's gone. But unfortunately it still prevails in, Robert Browning's dramatic monologue of 1851 is largely taken from Vasari. And so, this vision of the henpecked held back Andrea del Sarto, I'm afraid, prevails unto this day. So we've looked at, compositional studies and this life study of Lucrezia, his wife. And, I just love the fact that when you look at an Andrea del Sarto painting, when you look through a book of his work, you just see the same figures again and again and again. And you see a number of sort of studio assistants that he clearly uses to compose his paintings. And this is a drawing lent to us from Berlin. And it's, again, a drawing that is relatively rare in Andrea del Sarto's oeuvre. It's a so-called Garzone study, a study made from one of his studio assistants. And here he draws the studio assistant in order to make him into a figure of Sant'Ambrogio that you see on the right of this altarpiece. And I just love the idea that Del Sarto sort of, in the studio working one day, just calls one of his assistants, says, okay, come on, you be St. Ambrose, and he gives him the book and says, okay, stand like this. And of course here he's working out how the weight of the figure will be carried and will fall. And so in this study like this, he can actually really get to grips with that. But you see the Garzone still, wearing his tunic that he would wear in the studio, but suddenly transformed into this figure of Sant'Ambrogio, and then clothed. And I think one of the most one of the best preserved categories of Del Sarto's drawings are actually the head studies. We're missing a lot of the Garzone studies, compositional studies, but we do actually have quite a lot of head studies. And this is a magnificent sheet that came up at auction back in 2005. and is now in a private collection. A study for the St. Joseph in the Bracci Holy Family. And you can see how Andrea is already anticipating that the face will be truncated by the sleeve that he's resting on. So he literally is just drawing this figure and already just not bothering with the lower half. And this drawing was in Vasari's own collection, as you can tell by the decorative line border drawn around it, and with the Vasari wording that's put on it, the attribution to Andrea del Sarto. As I said, when you look through a book of Andrea del Sarto's work, you see the same characters again and again and again. And I'm sure, it's like the butcher's boy or the local priest or all these people that frequented the part of Florence that Andrea del Sarto was working in. And you see this youth's features again and again through the work as well. And I love this drawing that is lent from the National Gallery of Art in DC. And it's wonderful to be able to bring it together with the finished painting lent from the Galleria Palatina in Florence, and to bring these things together again. And of course, it's easy to forget that in putting together an exhibition like this, we're really bringing together objects that haven't seen each other for centuries. The last time that all of these drawings were together was in Andrea del Sarto's studio in 1530. And it's just amazing to think that, here they are again in dialogue, and that we can sort of bring them together and get a full view of his process. But with this particular sheet, it's wonderful to see how he makes this head study and then filters it through into to this very young St. John the Baptist. Most images of St. John the Baptist show a much older figure. But here he has a youthful figure. And Del Sarto, employing all the conventions of portraiture, all the conventions that we've seen in the National Gallery portrait of a man reading and turning, all of those conventions, the half-length format, etc., are here used for a religious figure and to bring this figure to life for the audience that Andrea del Sarto is painting for. This, I think, is one of the most gorgeous drawings in the exhibition. We used it as the catalogue cover, and it appears in as the head of Mary Magdalene in the Pietà di Luco of 1524. And of course, one of the wonderful things about Andrea del Sarto's art is just how much thought he puts into it. And it's an art that I think it just takes much more work for us today to really understand and get into. It's not, he's not Caravaggio. You're not just knocked sideways by the drama of it. You have to really think about the figures, about the characters, about the stories, as Andrea himself did. So here you have Mary Magdalene. And what's the thing that we all know about Mary Magdalene? That she anointed Christ's feet and dried them with her hair. So here, Andrea del Sarto makes her hair one of the key features of the drawing and one of the key features of the image, her hair dangling loose in a way that would have been very uncharacteristic of the period. Nowadays, we're so used to this sort of look. But, 500 years ago, this was thoroughly indecorous and perhaps in keeping with the Magdalene's past as a prostitute too. So back to Lucrezia, I said about how, this history with Vasari, and but the one thing that perhaps Vasari resented, but was the fact that Del Sarto absolutely adored Lucrezia and used her features for almost all the Madonnas that he painted. Here you have this very famous painting of the Madonna of the Harpies in the Uffizi of 1518. And whose features are they? They're the features of Lucrezia, taken literally from this very drawing. You can see the light and shade are handled in the same way. The features are the same. And these features appear again and again in all the Madonnas that you see Andrea del Sarto painting. with this work, the Madonna of the Steps, which is in the collection of the Prado, and is too fragile to travel, but we have a number of drawings in the exhibition that relate to it. And you just get a sense from this one slide, the variety of studies that he's making towards his paintings. Obviously, head studies, nude studies for the Christ child, head study, drapery studies, a nude study for the angel. Obviously, like any good Renaissance artist, he's studying the figures in the nude first so that he gets a good understanding of it, and then clothing it with drapery. And then these fragmentary studies of elbows and arms, etc. And in fact, the Virgin herself studied from a studio assistant to Guercino, who's told to adopt the pose. And here you also see the variety of red chalk that he uses. I mean, don't forget, red chalk, of which Andrea became such a master, was a naturally occurring medium. And so, it's dug out of the ground. You could get hard sticks of it, soft sticks of it. They varied from very orangey tones to very red tones, purpley tones. And I have to say, it made it a nightmare when we were doing the color proofing for the catalog. All these different red chalks, slightly different, and trying to reproduce them all in the catalog faithfully. But you see here, so this, one of the things that I began to understand in studying these sheets is that here, in these two sheets, he makes a life drawing of a child, and then the head here. But then in his subsidiary studies, he filters it through into what he wants in the painting. So the life study, he wants a Christ child with a slightly fuller belly, having just eaten. So in this subsidiary study, he studies that, and that's what he puts in the painting. And the same here, the mouth with the lips slightly more open and the line of the jaw are what was then finally used in the painting, as opposed to the very direct life study he had. One of the things that you think about when you see some of Andrea del Sarto's works is just the number of drawings that he must have made for them. And this is one of his greatest works. It's in Florence, the San Salvi Last Supper. If you ever get a chance to see it, please go. It's just outside the Viale, the old city wall of Florence. And so very few people go, but it's open to the public all the time, all day, every day. And you'll probably be there on your own, and it's absolutely startling as a work of art. The figure's almost life-size. And he probably made something like 200 drawings for a painting like this. And I think the fact that these works are in Florence and in frescoes, so they can't travel, is one of the reasons why Andrea del Sarto isn't so well known today as other artists. Because literally you have to go to Florence to really see his full glory. But for a painting like this, we have a number of wonderful studies. Head study here in black chalk, with the white of the paper for the highlights. And an arm, just an arm, but look how lovingly and sort of seriously it's treated, with this wonderful sculptural three-dimensional modeling of the arm, and really rendered with such sort of surety. Andrea del Sarto makes it look so easy, and yet, you try and copy these drawings, and it's not easy. And one of the joys of seeing the exhibition at the Getty was seeing so many artists in there sketching from these drawings, and then you just realize how difficult it is. Another wonderful jewel of his that still remains in Florence, the Chiostro dello Scalzo, small cycle of scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist. And again, we have a drawing that relates to this repoussoir figure at the front, a drapery study. And the good tailor's son that he is, he studies that drapery exactly, but then he adds a stole, a little sort of tunic on the top as well. And I can imagine there must have been dozens of drawings like this that he could then draw from as a resource. And this large fresco at Poggio Acaiano, just outside Florence, for which there's one of the banner image for the exhibition in the collection of the Tobys here in New York, and partially given by them to the Met. Wonderful head study for the Julius Caesar figure in one of his most important frescoes. And, a wonderfully sensitive observation of the figure, probably filtered through an antique representation of Julius Caesar on a medal. So we've looked at, compositional studies, life studies. I wanted to take a quick look at some of the practical tools that he used in making his paintings. And one of these I mentioned earlier, the fact that he reused drawings and he kept them in his studio as a resource. So this sheet, in which he just studies a simple kneeling figure with drapery, you'll see that drapery appears in this wonderful fresco at Poggio, but it appears absolutely the same in this painting from about the same date of the Adoration of the Magi. And you really get a sense of he's not just reusing them from sort of laziness. He just has this already, and why not reuse it? It's efficient workshop practice. And this is getting into the 1520s, when his studio was by far the most busy and productive in Florence, and just deluged with commissions. And again, you see the figure of the Christ child here, who again is reused from the, probably done first in this painting, but then reused in the same pose for the Madonna of the Sack about 5 years later. And head studies reused as well. It's one of the joys of PowerPoint and modern technology is being able to put all these things side by side. But this gorgeous drawing from the Uffizi that was reused for the painting of the Charity in the National Gallery, the Bulgarian Holy Family at the Met, and also the St. Petersburg Holy Family as well. And these two paintings actually feature in an exhibition, a small dossier show that will open in a week's time at the Met, where they will, our colleagues there will examine the relationship between them, and you can see there's obviously a very close links. And in the case of this drawing, we can see actually which one it was made for first, and that was the drawing. This drawing is on the back, on the verso of the sheet, and was clearly used for this painting in St. Petersburg, which dates to about 1527 and predates these two. One of the most useful tools in terms of looking at Del Sarto's work in recent years, and particularly for this project, has been the infrared reflectogram, in which the camera basically looks beneath the paint surface of the painting, and it picks up carbon, so it picks up black chalk underneath the surface. And the technology has advanced so much in recent years, so that it's now, these images are really legible. People who were in the field 20 years ago, you'll recognize that these sort of images used to be, stitched together, composite mosaicked images, and fuzzy and difficult to work with. Now they're just crystal clear. And, when I first saw this image, it was kindly taken for us by the Opificio in Florence. And, obviously of the Medici Holy Family that's in the exhibition. When I first saw it and I saw all these black lines, I thought somebody had gone over it with a black marker or something. It was just so clear. And it's just miraculous for us to be able to see here the carbon of the black chalk underdrawing, and even here some freehand underdrawing as well. And just to explain what we're seeing here, particularly with these dark lines, is actually the cartoon transfer lines. And this was the technique by which Andrea and other artists would make these panel paintings. So you have a cartoon, which is, our word cartoon, Disney cartoon, comes from the Italian cartone, large sheet of paper. And that cartone was made from lots of sheets of paper stuck together, and they would then map out the composition on it, and then lay it on top of the panel where they wanted to make the painting. And then they would have blackened the back of it. They then score the outlines. So it's literally like a carbon copy, if any of you remember carbon copies. So you literally have this interleaved sheet with carbon on the back, and you score the outlines. And that means you can then reuse the cartoon, but you have these dark carbon lines from which to work on the panel itself. And if you isolate all these lines, in this case, this is the image you get. And you can see clearly some of the changes he made with, for instance, the arm of John the Baptist is, in the final painting, he lowered it. Clearly, realizing that if he kept this iteration, it would have looked as if, the St. John was about to hit sort of Christ child in the face or something like that. And then you'll see, a few other variations in the fringe here, and Christ originally drawn nude, but then covered with drapery in the final painting. And using, all these tools, we can get a wonderful image of how the process was from this wonderful drawing in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum that is then filtered through the cartoon transfer lines into the final painting, and thereby making St. Elizabeth much younger in the process. And clearly, the takeaway lesson from this is to moisturize daily, and we'll all be all right. So back to the reuse of cartoons. It's sort of startling to us, but we have these 3 different paintings where he uses a fragment of drapery that is essentially the same. In this one, he'll put Christ's leg over it, and he makes slight modifications, but even this blue drapery on the right is the same. And, one gets a sense. I mean, he's the tailor's son. He's used to working with sewing patterns and seeing how things are put together. And I can just imagine him laying out fragments of cartoons on the floor and basically, when his studio is busy like this, basically putting together a composition, and then obviously working very hard to make it homogeneous. Michael Gallagher has called this sort of practice sort of Frankensteining, and it sort of is, but Sarto works so hard to make sure that it's absolutely a homogeneous composition, and it doesn't look like it's piecemeal put together. And probably, his contemporaries may have known that he did this, but a lot of them would have been totally unaware of it. And it's only now, with the benefit of hindsight, that we can see this. And we see it again and again. So you have also, over a period of time, the Disputa in the Galleria Palatina that dates to about 1517, and the Gambassi Holy Family from about 1528. And you have this same figure that reappears, 10 years apart, but, with slightly different colors, but basically, essentially the same drapery and the same clothes. And you can see in his 2 major assumptions that are both in the Galleria Palatina, just how much he uses the cartoon again and reuses it, the central figure with arms slightly adjusted. But all these sort of thoughtful adjustments, but basically using very similar prototypes. Why reinvent the wheel, basically? And, you may ask, well, how many of these cartoons survive? And the answer is very few. We have literally a few head studies that are fragments of cartoons. This was always called the only main surviving figural cartoon, and related to the Disputa figure here. But actually, and it is, as you can see here, it's blackened on the back for transfer to the panel. There's only one problem, and that is, this is a slightly disorienting photograph taken from the balcony of the Uffizi study room, looking down on the drawing with a scale reproduction of the painting here. And you can see the problem is that it's a lot smaller. So clearly, it may be by Del Sarto, possibly. But if so, it was actually made just to make a smaller version of the painting or something like that. It wasn't actually made as a preliminary cartoon for this, the painting that it's always been associated with. And, scale is something that one always has to think about. And this is, when I was working on this project, I was lucky enough to get full-scale printouts of this wonderful picture from Cleveland, unfinished, and the infrared that relates to it, so that we could really work out the relationship between them all. And this painting is wonderful because it's unfinished. So you have, you can see on the right-hand side, this donkey. You can actually see the cartoon transfer lines with the naked eye and the imprimatura underneath. And you really get a full sense of his working process. There are 3 versions of this composition, all by Andrea del Sarto, one at Cleveland here, a quarter-size version in the Prado, and a slightly larger version in Dresden with his monogram, so a finished final work. And art historians have spent a lot of ink over which one came first and the order that they were done in. And we have this wonderful, the donkey, the drawing which is on show downstairs, but donkey that appears in these 2 versions, but not in this version in Cleveland. And with the infrared image of the Prado painting, we can actually see, it's a bit of a mess as an image, I'm afraid, but we can actually see from this that the Prado painting was the central one between the Cleveland painting and the Dresden one. So the cartoon with the donkey here was transferred, but then actually freehand painted in was the donkey in the background as well. And you can see that he made the figures, the adjustments to the figures in the background as well, through that image there. So we've had a look at sort of the whole gamut of Del Sarto's preparatory process. I just wanted to finish with a discovery and a mystery. In looking at these 3 paintings and the relationship between them, we were looking at the new infrared reflectograms of these works. And we had very good images of the Cleveland painting and the Prado one. But the Dresden one, a colleague in Cleveland, Marcia Steele, managed to get some preliminary images from it. And there was something very curious. I don't know if you can see, but there are a bunch of lines that seem to have nothing to do with the Del Sarto composition. You'll see them here outlined in yellow. And then if you turn them upside down, they sort of make sense, right? But there's still nothing to do with Andrea del Sarto. So, when we sort of got this image and we isolated the lines, and this building just seemed awfully familiar. And, of course, I've raced through all the Andrea del Sarto books, but there's no temple like that in the background of any of his paintings. But, bizarrely, Pietro Perugino, 1502 to 1504, there's this temple in the background, and it's exactly the same. Down to sort of details, little architectural details. Even some of the figures, it turned out, in this preliminary image, were details of Perugino's figures. So, what the hell's going on? Perugino's altarpiece here was actually a model for Raphael's, which is how I got to it, because Raphael, much more famous, but he also used a similar temple in the back. But what I think happened is that basically Perugino had 2 studios in Perugia and in Florence. He died in 1523. And so Del Sarto, I think, when Perugino's studio was dispersed, Del Sarto was, then the most productive studio in Florence, and probably bought up, unfinished panels. They were valuable. They were prepared panels. So he bought up an unfinished version of this composition, then literally turned it upside down and used it for his own sacrifice of Isaac. And it's just one of these things that, I feel we're really on the cusp of a lot of these sort of discoveries where we can just slowly start getting a glimpse into how these artists work and what was going on. And of course, at the period we have just so few documents, and there are very few letters, there are few legal documents. But it's through work like this that we can actually really piece together what's going on in these Renaissance studios. So on to the mystery. And we had about a month ago a symposium in, some of you will know this cast of characters, but we had a symposium in Los Angeles and we looked at some of these issues. And one of the most difficult ones that we were wrestling with is the matter of incisions. And this is something that Marcia Steele at the Cleveland Museum of Art highlighted. She found in her analysis of this painting that there were all these lines sort of incised, they seem to be incised below the paint layer, but clearly sort of arching lines, perhaps relating to the composition, perhaps not. She made up these images where you have the Cleveland painting with the incised lines and the Prado painting with the incised lines also. And, you can see there's some tie-in perhaps to the lines. And, we postulate that maybe they're to do with scaling of the image, because the Prado painting is quarter size, of course, to the Cleveland one. Some had to do with, cartoon transfer. It's an open question. I'm sure that, in 5 years' time, somebody cleverer than me or us will have worked it all out. But it's a real mystery, and it's sort of, and some people, and I have my doubts as to what purpose they serve. But I really wonder if they even relate to the compositions. But they are found again and again on the on Del Sarto paintings. Now we're looking for them, so you'll see them in the Met dossier show as well. They feature, and you can actually see them in the infrared images. I don't know if you can see those crossing lines there. They're actually almost more visible in the infrareds than actually in life. And here again, images courtesy of Marcia Steele, where you can see some of these incisions, the incised lines, isolated. So, one of those mysteries that will remain. And, as I say, we've thought about, what purpose they might serve. And I'm sure, years down the line, we may have figured it out. And we know, with Andrea del Sarto, we're only starting to now get a glimpse of his whole working process. We're now understanding that, he made a lot of drawings after he transferred the cartoon to the panel. All these things that 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I was saying happily, artists drew and drew and drew, and then transferred the cartoon and then painted, and that's it. And now we're getting a sense of a much richer, more sort of interleaved process for the whole, the way that these paintings were produced. And I think with Andrea del Sarto and Andrea Danielo del Sarto, we get a sense of how, the tailor's son is, how that sort of comes out in his work as well. And I'm sure, again, maybe the incisions have something to do with that as well, and we'll perhaps know in due course. I'll just leave on another little mystery. Vasari talks about in his life of Del Sarto, he says, well, Domenico Conti was left the heir of Andrea's drawings and artistic things, but made little progress in painting. And it's believed that some artists stole them one night, and it is never known what became of them. And, it's a mystery to this day. And so, if somebody approaches you with a bunch of Andrea del Sarto drawings, be a little circumspect. Maybe they're stolen property from 500 years ago. But I would urge you just instead to enjoy the drawings that we have on view here at the Frick until January the 10th. 45 drawings out of a total surviving corpus of 180 drawings. So really, and of course, we think all the best drawings. So do please enjoy the show, and thank you very much for your attention this evening.